British politics is getting used to a new acronym, WFM, working from Manchester, because the Prime Minister's new northern outpost of number 10 Downing Street is fully in operation from now. We'll discuss what it reveals and how it's actually going to work on this episode of Newscast. Well, here in the studio with me is Lucy Fisher, Whitehall editor at the Financial Times. Hello, Lucy.
Hi, Adam.
Are we allowed to reveal the quite showbiz project that we did together a few weeks ago?
I think we are. I think we should.
Because they've announced the main cast and we're the minor cast. So yeah, Lucy and I were invited to be in a press conference in the new Sky series, The War Game, which is like a real-time simulation of a war, and we're the journalists.
We got to play ourselves, which I felt was quite glamorous.
yeah, and we went to like a fake number 10 Downing Street, although I don't know if we're allowed to reveal that much.
Are we allowed to reveal who the Deputy Prime Minister who gave a press conference was?
Who we quizzed, yeah.
It was Nicola Sturgeon, and I was very worried that I was going to corpse and ruin the whole shoot, but luckily she was so plausible, wasn't she, that I managed to keep it together.
She played the role very well, and that will be available on Sky in, I think, September it's coming out, but we're very minor, so we don't get involved in the publicity. But anyway, right, also joining us, Patrick Maguire from The Times. Hello, Patrick.
Hello, Adam. I'm very disappointed you weren't talking about celebrity traitors, which I allowed myself to believe for a brief but fleeting moment.
But the funny thing about that is I was away for the weekend in Inverness when they started filming the new series. And so I got to the airport to fly home, and everyone in the airport was super excited because there'd just been loads of celebrities flying in. And then I thought, should I suggest that maybe I'm the surprise 21st contestant? But then I was like, well, I'm going home. That means I got kicked out on day one. So I decided not to do that. Anyway, also, Patrick, we've been teasing Henry Zeffman all week about you saying that he should go in Celebrity Mastermind.
Well, that was exactly what I thought would happen. The teasing, yes, but, when you leave the inky world of Fleet Street that Lucy and I toil on for telly and particularly the BBC, you ascend to another plane of national renown, Adam. I was speaking to Henry about this week. You've already been on Celebrity Mastermind.
Yeah, we don't need to remind everyone
it's only
of
a
that
matter
again.
Of time.
But Lucy, today, as we're recording on Friday, is the inauguration of Number 10 North. And did I see a photo? And you can't tell if things are AI or real anymore. Did I see a photo of them all posing in front of a fake Number 10 black door in the foyer of the building?
I also saw that and assumed it was real, but now I'm wondering if I was being naive.
Yeah. What's your take on how Number 10 North is shaping up?
Well, look, as far as stunts go, it's a good one. It's yet to be seen if it's going to be more than a gimmick. I thought it was, Burnham was approaching the level of gushing today when he talked about this being the happiest moment, potentially, of his entire life, to see this Number 10 North, local branch.
Bear in mind, this is a man who is married and has children and has recently become Prime Minister, and this is the best day of his life.
Yes, I was wondering if he was going to get a slight clip round the ear from his wife this evening over that comment. It's clearly important to him. We've seen with the makeup of his cabinet a huge emphasis on MPs from the north and the northwest coming into the top ministerial roles, and even sort of lower down the ministerial ranks, a pivot away from a more southern and London-focused emphasis. And of course, devolution is the big idea at the heart of his government. I still think we need to see a lot more detail on how he's going to parcel out powers and resources to the regions, and to what level in particular. Because while it doesn't surprise me that many MPs, many in local government, are very excited about this idea of having more autonomy, the mood music from business has been a lot more cautious. And you can imagine, especially if you're a national business or a major employer, that if you're suddenly having to deal with a patchwork of different planning and infrastructure rules, different skills regimes, if there's some level of fiscal devolution, or there are grants or other schemes that require a huge administrative burden to apply all over the place, and to try and, work out how to get hold of little pots of money, that will soon become a nightmare for business.
And Patrick, do we know who is going to be working in Number 10 North? Because I've seen reports that some cabinet ministers, but not necessarily all of them, are sort of going to maybe hot desk there during the week, but there's also talk of actual units within government departments going there permanently.
Yeah, indeed. I think the expectation, is that every cabinet minister will be expected to work there on a regular basis. Some of them, Lucy Powell, Louise Haigh, as some of the names mentioned, will be there fairly often on a weekly basis was the briefing this week. I suspect Alex Norris, the new Justice Secretary, who, despite being a Nottingham MP, is from Manchester and is a massive Manchester City fan, may well find a regular
how
pretext.
convenient.
And may well find a regular pretext to see how his tricky brief is going from a Mancunian vantage point as well. And obviously, you've had this suggestion of financial relocation packages for officials. What's interesting, though, about the reshuffle is seeing the number of junior ministers who've been appointed to 2 or, in some cases, 3 briefs, 3 departments rather, right? So you've got Dan Tomlinson, for instance, Treasury Minister, but also joint with the Cabinet Office. You've got others who are joint with, say, the Ministry of Housing, Local Government, Department for Transport. That does suggest that this department, Number 10 North, is going to become an engine room for that sort of cross-departmental, cross-cutting thinking. It's interesting, by the way.
And not trying to like bust out of the silos that exist in Whitehall.
Yeah, exactly. But what's interesting about the department is there is no minister for Number 10 North. I mean, the argument is Andy Burnham is, Louise Haigh is. But there are questions from ministers, certainly. I was speaking to one of them yesterday who said, look, Number 10 North, people being ministers in 2 or 3 departments at once, great idea, but it all seems to me, said this minister, to be a recipe for people being captured by their officials because they'll be bouncing between places. They'll never be able to truly grip one department. And listening to what Lucy said about devolution there, I completely agree that a patchwork of local regimes, particularly in a party system this complicated, by the way, is probably a recipe for business anxiety. But when they announced this Number 10 North thing last month, I remember having conversations with Andy Burnham's team, and they were very pleased, not about the devolution stuff, but the way they see it, and the proof will be in the pudding as to whether it's seen this way in Whitehall and particularly by the Treasury. They thought the most important thing about Number 10 North was not the North bit and not the sort of hopey, changey, happy, clappy devolution stuff Andy Burnham was talking about, but the suggestion that it represented Number 10, be that in the North or in the South, taking control of growth policy. Now, can they implement it? Do they have the ministers? Will they have the officials? And crucially, will the system in Whitehall think Number 10 North is the same thing as Number 10 South? That's the big test. And I thought it was interesting. A grand old man of Whitehall was saying to me this morning, they were reading Andy Burnham's piece in The Guardian on this morning, and the last sentence of it was basically a warning to the civil service saying, I'm serious about it, get on board. And this very experienced Whitehall old hand said, you don't put that in there unless you think the system is going to kick back. So that's one to watch. Do they think Number 10 North is the same thing as Number 10?
Yeah, Lucy, what do you think about that theory there, that actually it's not necessarily about northern representation or giving a northern flavour to the government to balance the very southern flavour of Whitehall, that actually it's a way of kind of reinventing how government is done to make it feel a bit more modern? And also less captured by the Treasury, who like to say no to things.
Well, I think that is a big part of it. And I've spoken to people close to the new Chancellor, John Healey, who say that, he accepts that will be the way that things are, that Number 10 is the engine of the economy within government, trying to focus on growth and catalysing growth and, making the UK attractive for inward investment, while the Treasury is more sort of traditional sort of tax and spend department. Let's see how that goes. I mean...
how many times? And we're not
exactly.
that old, but we've lived through enough versions of things where the Prime Minister or if the Prime Minister's allies in Number 10 say, yes, we've basically got the keys to the Treasury and we will tell them what to do. And I mean, it never really ends up working that way.
No, normally, events happen. A Prime Minister is quickly forced onto the back foot to react. And of course, I was very struck that in the lead up to the changeover of power this week, both Keir Starmer and Theresa May made these very pointed public remarks about how international affairs impinge pretty quickly, especially at a time of global turbulence as we're living through now. And so while I'm sure that Andy Burnham, as Prime Ministers before him, want to concentrate on the domestic and reform within the UK's borders, it may be that he quite quickly finds he has to spend more time abroad dealing with various issues that arise in multilateral forums.
And not to turn this into an Institute for Government podcast, which would be very interesting, and they make very good podcasts if you're into that stuff. But Patrick, I noticed your column, a lot of that is about where individual desks are, not in Number 10 North, but in the old school buildings in Downing Street. Why is that so important?
Yeah, a couple of people in number 10 were talking to me this week, and they said, you won't believe who's got a desk in the outer office. And I had to ask for a brief primer on what the outer office was, because there are lots of rooms in number 10. And as someone, alas, who has not yet become a regular visitor to number 10 under any Prime Minister, at least not the bits of it they actually work from and don't put on nice canapes for hacks like us I sort of had a vague idea, but the outer office is the office directly outside of the Prime Minister's study. And who, as of this week, has got a desk in there? None other than Antonio Romeo, the Cabinet Secretary, who would usually sit, and he still does have an office, in the Cabinet Office. And, speaking to people who've been in number 10 before, I said, is this the usual thing? Does the Cabinet Secretary usually sit directly outside the Prime Minister's office? And all of them said, no, that is a sign that Andy Burnham means what he says, and he and Louise Haigh are really, really trying with their new Office for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet to turn number 10 into the real power centre of government, right? Because number 10 traditionally has been pretty underpowered. It's not really a department in its own right. It's sort of sometimes forced to act as the sort of referee or umpire of other departments rather than driving that change for the centre. So the Cabinet Secretary taking up a desk right outside the PM's office is a sign that is now really the new locus of government. And as Dan York-Smith, who's the Prime Minister's most senior civil service aide, said to colleagues in a message earlier this week, when you go through the link door between number 10 and 70 Whitehall, where the Cabinet Office is, now on the other side of that door is no longer the massive all-powerful department of the past, but in his words, a smaller department that is much more focused on policy, cross-government work, specifically support the PM, not running a whole range of stuff. So it's a really, it's a small thing, it's a techie thing, it's a nerdy thing. I know you like those in Newscast, Adam, but yes. It's symbolic, is what it is.
Well, and I suppose, Lucy, the reason Andy Burnham would see a need for those kind of changes and to grip things is because so many of his predecessors have said the same thing, which is like whatever metaphor they use, they reach for the lever of power and it comes off in their hand and it's not connected to anything.
Well, absolutely. And when you look at Downing Street, well, just the physical infrastructure, it is a Georgian townhouse. It's not really set up like a modern office, and it is a sort of warren of corridors that, as Patrick sort of made clear there, reaches sort of back into the Cabinet Office. I'm not surprised to hear that the Cabinet Office itself is being retooled and renamed to become the Office of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet in order to try and be more streamlined, be more focused on delivery. And I think Antonia Romeo, she's a real operator. She is someone that understands small p politics. And I think actually, in a sense, Burnham is lucky to have her and someone with such a grip on the civil service and who wants to sort of push reform through. So I think she will be crucial to the success or failure of this administration.
The reason I'm slightly smiling is there's a great video from the first cabinet meeting where she is sat next to Andy Burnham and she's got a huge notepad and a big pen and she's writing down, it looks like every single word he's saying. And then I'm wondering, the email that we get 2 hours later of what Andy Burnham told the cabinet, is that coming from that notebook that she then goes and types into her laptop and sends out as an email? But she looked like she was taking some very thorough notes. And you also just think, she wants to be in charge of AI rollout across the government. And like for the person who's in charge of using AI to make the public services more efficient, to be sat there with a massive notebook in front of the world's media just kind of made me chuckle a little bit.
Come on, though. She, it was cameras rolling, look busy.
Patrick, when we talk about the things that Andy Burnham has delivered this week, the thing that I just think about it is, okay, these are things that may help people with the cost of living. They might feel like good things to kind of hit the ground running with, but they're not exactly new ideas. They're tinkering or revising things that other prime ministers have done. And I was expecting something maybe a little bit more imaginative.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I think there's something in that criticism. But I remember, I remember as if it were, a decade ago. And in some respects, it does feel like a decade ago. But I saw Andy Burnham last Sunday, the day before he became Prime Minister, his last afternoon as a free man. And he'd just been in the Treasury that morning talking through some of these announcements, the announcements we've seen this week. He was very pleased. There was no tension in the system, he said. But, I said to him, how are you going to convey to people that you get it and that help is coming? The cavalry is coming, in his words, on the cost of living, on everything that is making our politics so volatile. and everything that ultimately screwed over Keir Starmer in terms of his standing in the electorate. And he was quite candid. He said, I'm not going to come in and say, all the things I'm going to do, which he didn't reveal to me then, but we had a good idea of what they were, are going to fix things overnight in the way that people want. But what I hope people see is that I get it and that I am making moves towards it and that the moves themselves recognise it. Right? I used the word demonstrative before, and it's a bit like that. It's about showing, in his view, the government has agency and that he has empathy and that he can't do everything, but he's showing people he's moving towards it. And I think that is the political objective in all of this. Yes, sort of something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue quality to some of the policy, but he's doing it. He's doing something. The internal mantra in number 10, what's at the top of the notes that are circulating on how they want to communicate this, it is the phrase Andy gets stuff done. That's the internal mission statement in number 10. Andy gets stuff done. And that's the impression they're trying to convey. Even if the stuff is small, right? It's stuff that he is trying to show them, right? It's not just I'm getting stuff done. It's I'm getting the stuff you care about done.
And also, Lucy, I'm getting slightly tired of seeing press releases talking about breathing space. But then that means when political journalists are tired of it, it means that members of the public are maybe hearing it for the first time. And you realise the breathing space formulation is actually quite neat, isn't it? Because it fills the gap between now and this 10-year plan for the future of the country that he's promised in the autumn. So you can be doing something in the short term while they're beavering away on something for the long term.
I think that's right. And I think that is broadly what a new administration needs to do, particularly with a takeover prime minister coming in without a huge sort of nationwide political campaign during an election, to really frame themselves for the public. Because there'll be many people who don't really remember Andy Burnham from the first time round in the cabinet, who haven't been aware of him as Greater Manchester Mayor for the past decade. And therefore, given that it was a key criticism of Keir Starmer that he was too sluggish to define himself and therefore was defined by his critics, I think Burnham has done quite a good job this week in defining himself and whose side he's on. It is, ordinary people and the left behind. And I do think, Patrick is right. Taken individually, a lot of these measures are quite small, but together as a package, whether it's ending rough sleeping, capping bus fares, cutting VAT on energy bills, it's important to sort of show whose side he's on, and also to say a little bit about himself. The idea of cutting business rates for pubs, clubs and live music venues allowed him to be, in a bar, pulling a pint, giving his sort of blokish quips and trying to project his persona for those people who don't know him very well.
What was so interesting for me was I was doing Antisocial on Radio 4 on Friday lunchtime, and we were doing a programme about the sort of the culture and the identity stuff around the North-South divide. And obviously it was inspired by Andy Burnham becoming Prime Minister. And in my mind, I'd felt there'd been a bit of a backlash already to how he presents himself as being Northern and his Northernness as part of his brand. But then you go back through his social media and actually, Patrick, it's not as explicitly Northern as you might think. And you realise, that's people caricaturing him, because there's a video of him in Cardiff. There's a video of him at the bus garage in Bristol. He's pulling a pint to advertise the business rates relief for pubs, but that's just a pint in a pub. It's not a working man's club in the north. So I wonder if actually he's not projecting quite as much Northern bloke as people maybe think.
Well, yeah, he's projecting Northern bloke in that at the end of the day, he is one, despite the Cambridge degree. I think it's still possible to be a bloke from the Northwest if you've been to a good university. At least I hope I would embody that myself, Adam. But no, I think you're right. He has a very strong political brand, and as such, he's easy to parody. He's easy to pigeonhole. To a certain extent, by the way, that might be a strength, right? What was Keir Starmer ever parodied for? What definition did he have? The flip side of that is, of course,
hair, basically.
Well,
a really slick haircut. Yeah.
Moisturised every day. People forget that about Keir Starmer. He told me that once in 2020. Every morning. Explain why he still looks quite good for his age.
Yeah.
Anyway, we digress. I think the difficulty with having such a strong regional brand is, if you look at The Economist had some fascinating polling last week. It was like a heat map of where Andy Burnham was good for the Labour brand and where he polled less well. Well, Labour polled less well with him on the ballot. And basically, there was no real disaster zone, but you saw it was really hot in the northwest, quite hot in the southwest, and really hot in the northeast. And then there was just this sort of, and bits of the Midlands as well, but there was this sort of ribbon from the southeast across to South Wales where it was not so hot. And that is the difficulty. But you're right, he has been all over the country. And I think the essence of this, and he'll have to find a way to communicate it more clearly. I wrote about this in the Times last week. What matters to Andy Burnham and the people around Andy Burnham is, crucially, it's not London, right? It is anywhere in the UK that's not London. That's the sort of, that I think has been the defining cultural divide in the Labour Party for a while. And when he talks about changing culture and priorities, it's about that as much as anything else. And that has been sort of terrain that Nigel Farage has owned politically for a very long time. That's not to say, of course, that London's not important to the Labour Party. I mean, it's very important to the Labour Party. Most of its membership is in London and the South East. But that's probably a more useful frame to understand it from. London Labour versus what some people might call normal Labour. Not that there aren't any normal people in London, but that is a frame that some people, influential supporters of Andy Burnham, that's how they see the world.
And that's one of the things I gleaned from this episode of Antisocial, which is available to listen to on BBC Sounds now, which is that if you actually look at the North-South divide, and a really kind of authoritative way of measuring where that is and how big it is to look at a basket of statistics like number of graduates, house prices, average earnings, and health. So like people's life expectancies. And you then get a line which includes Wales being in the north and means that Leicester's in the south, but Nottingham's in the north. And so you then realise geographically it gets a little bit skewed and weird. And then you realise the key thing is that London is so different from everywhere else. So actually, Lucy, that's just repeating Patrick's point, but kind of with a bit more of a geography angle.
I do think the pendulum might have swung too far back the other way, though, and he is potentially at risk of creating a southern discomfort. And I think that the purge of the Starmerites, which was pretty brutal and savage, could come back to bite him. And getting rid of, Peter Kyle in Brighton, Darren Jones in Bristol, Steve Reed in London, and others, in the south, it has been such a pendulum shift. Has it gone too far the other way? I'm also interested in some of the people he's sacked or demoted, people like Darren Jones, Peter Kyle, Lucy Rigby, who remains a Treasury Minister but demoted from Chief Secretary, who I would call, and they may not thank me for this, but Tory-coded Labour MPs in that, if you had the volume off on the telly, or there's something like their presentation or the way they speak, their register, and quite sort of right of centre for the Labour Party politics, which I think is more appealing to centrist or Tory curious voters or people who have voted Conservative in the past. So I think, again, he might be missing a trick there in sort of narrowing the appeal of Labour by losing some of those players from the front bench.
And talking of somebody who would be very happy to be described as Tory-coded because she is the leader of the Conservative Party, is Kemi Badenoch, who did a big speech on the economy this week, which she did on a very sunny rooftop in London. And then afterwards, she was taking questions. And here is her response when she was asked about Andy Burnham's pledge to cut business rates for pubs.
Our business rates policy will abolish business rates for most of the high street. So it would include all the places that Andy Burnham has talked about, but it would also have retail. It would also have restaurants. Hospitality is one of the areas that is hardest hit by Labour's jobs tax. Andy Burnham is not reversing that. What we're saying is we found the money and a better way to actually make life easier for them. So I'm happy that he is focusing on those businesses. He should focus on more. I'm worried that this is just a pie in the sky announcement because he hasn't said where the money is going to come from. How can we believe him?
Yeah, Lucy, isn't it interesting there that Kemi Badenoch is attacking Andy Burnham for kind of not being ambitious enough, even though Andy Burnham's whole thing is like, I want to be really ambitious and do things differently.
It's not surprising, right? That's the job of the leader of the opposition, even when they agree with what the government's doing, to say, well, you're not being bold enough or going far enough or doing it fast enough. So I wasn't surprised in that sense. And I'm sure it's quite frustrating for an opposition party when the government of the day nicks your policy or part of it. For me, one of the other really interesting things of Kemi Badenoch's intervention this week was to talk about, in very unabashed terms, how she is, tacking rightwards in the party. The policies are changing, the people are changing, the processes are changing, she said. And there's been this big furore around Sir Grant Shapps being blocked from running again as a parliamentary candidate for the Tories. He's held 6 cabinet briefs. He was an MP for almost 20 years before he lost his Welwyn Hatfield seat at the last election. And I think it's really setting down a marker that, this is a renewed party. She wants the public to understand it's a fresh proposition that she's putting to them, something more full-blooded in its conservatism, and therefore saying, we don't want anyone who doesn't agree that the 2050 push for net zero needs to be ditched. We don't want anyone who doesn't agree we need to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. And I spoke to Kevin Hollenrake, the Tory chair this week, who it was fascinating how much he was sort of leaning into this, saying, look, there are people we like and admire who just don't reflect Kemi Badenoch's brand of conservatism. And therefore, the implication is they can apply to stand for other parties or be associated, with other movements across the spectrum. But they're trying to improve the definition of themselves. The risk, of course, is that they are narrowing the band of their appeal. And again, there are many sort of centrists who will be feeling fairly homeless with the direction in which the Tories are headed. And
Patrick, you shared a few private jet flights with Nigel Farage in the last few months as part of your work, obviously, just to be clear, to be a fly on the wall. But where's he been this week?
Well, what Reform are doing, I think, is really interesting because they have had a pretty rough and tumble time with the mainstream media of late. In Westminster, if you mention the Clacton by-election, people will either say, oh, is that still going on? Or, ha, 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 we love Count Binface or something. Right, so
and a full list of candidates is available on the BBC News website, and there's 33 others.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ash, it's a very, very long list of candidates. I'm very sorry for opening that can of worms. But what Reform are now trying to do is show and prove that they can circumvent the usual channels of politics and consolidate that 25 to 30% of the vote, probably close to 25% of the vote, that has been pretty immovable for them. Now, they're doing that. How they're doing that, they are streaming their own content online. Right? Nigel Farage gave a big speech this week about the need for a general election. Lots of people wouldn't have seen it. But, it was doing big numbers on Reform's social channels. He's been in Clacton a lot, right? So they're using this period to road test a series of techniques, a way of doing politics that they think allows them to circumvent establishment channels. We'll see. But, we're going to see another summer in which, and Reform have done this the past 2 summers, maybe in a slightly less high-profile way, maybe in a way that gets less coverage from the Westminster media, given a new government, but where they are road testing techniques they think they can take forward into elections and continue hitting their high spots of electoral performance. Let's see. Andy Burnham may complicate that, but it's in their view, it's still all to play for, and that Andy Burnham's hold on seats like Makerfield will be a passing fancy. So let's see.
I'm really interested to see when the crossover moment comes in the polls, if indeed it does come. If you look at the end of this week, it looks like Labour have had a bit of a bump from Andy Burnham. They're beginning to trickle up. Reform have been trickling down this spring, and it could be they're only a couple of points apart in some pollsters' estimation. And I think that could be a really big boost for Andy Burnham, showing that he's making progress, rewarding the confidence of those MPs that have put him in place and ousted Starmer. And again, very bad news if that does happen for Farage, after it feels like Reform's lost momentum this year.
My favourite thing I've gleaned from the polling this week is that YouGov favourability tracker of all the different prime ministers of the last few years. And it shows that when they announce they're resigning, they become instantly more popular. Funny that. Lucy, great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Adam.
And Patrick, thanks for joining us down the line.
Thank you, Adam.